Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rachel Wesson. I'm the Events and Communications Specialist at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. And I'm very happy to welcome you all to today's seminar, The Computer Says No, But Can I Believe Him? Thoughts on Auditing Artificial Intelligence with Anni Hellman. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Institute of European Studies, the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, and the Center for Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence. It's my pleasure to introduce Jeroen de Wolf, who is the director of the Berkeley Institute for European Studies. And he is here to provide some brief opening remarks and introduce our main speaker for today's seminar. Jeroen, over to you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon or good morning or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us today. My name is indeed Jeroen de Wolf. I'm the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, either in person or on Zoom. Today's speaker is Anni Hellman, and allow me to briefly introduce our speaker. Anni Hellman is the Deputy Head of Unit of the EU Commission Directorate-General for Communication Networks, Content and Technology. Anni holds a degree in mathematics, in actuarial sciences and computer sciences from the University of Turku in Finland. Anna is currently a visiting scholar here in Berkeley at our Institute of European Studies, and she is the 2022 EU Fellow on the Berkeley campus. And let me just say a word about this EU fellowship. In the context of this program, a high-ranked administrator from the European Commission or the European Parliament comes to the Berkeley campus and then stays a year with us on campus as a guest of the Institute of European Studies. During this stay, the EU Fellow also works on a research project, which in Anni's case deals with the challenges of how and whether the trustworthiness and fairness of artificial intelligence and algorithms could be verified. Anni Hellman prepared for us today a presentation that will take about 35 minutes, and that will be followed by a Q&A. But for now, please relax and enjoy the presentation that Anni Hellman prepared for us, a presentation entitled The Computer Says No, But Can I Believe Him? Thoughts on Auditing Artificial Intelligence. Please join me in welcoming Anni Hellman.
Okay, so I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much, Jeroen, for the kind words. And I'm going to take my and thank you very much for CLTC and BIDS and IES for having me over as a co-sponsored and CHAI, sorry. So I shall start by sharing my screen. Let's see. So let's get going. So computer says no, but can I believe him? This rather funny name has a few meanings in it, so I will come to those right away. This road here is the long straight road towards Death Valley, which I think kind of is symbolic for the long road that we have ahead with AI. So this is where the name came from. This was at a fog design and art exhibition at Fort Mason. And I found it wonderful. It's a huge mirror and it only has the words, the computer says no. So I kind of thought, okay, so he does, but can I believe him? And this is a bit the issue with AI. The AI gives a result, but if it doesn't say why, can I really believe him? Okay, now it goes ahead. Sorry about that. So I'm going to look at three different issues shortly. What artificial intelligence is or how it's defined. And on the audit part, I'm going to focus on that part of audits, which is very much discussed these days, which is kind of the ethical aspects of AI. And then in the end, I will say a few words about the European Commission's proposal for an Artificial Intelligence Act. The work on that is ongoing. So this is a definition of artificial intelligence. I want to make sure that I'm right. So I took the definition from Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig in their book, Artificial Intelligence, The Modern Approach, which is basically the Bible of AI. And there it says that AI is the designing and building of intelligent agents that receive percepts from the environment and take actions that affect that environment. Basically, AI is something or somebody in a way doing things that need intelligence, but humans kind of delegate those tasks to the AI. It is a very wide concept, so defining it very precisely is a bit challenging. But what do we talk about when we talk about AI? I mean, who is he? Because there's software and there's hardware of AI. Is it its creator, its funder? What I would say is that it's, as any computer program that we do, it bears the history and culture of its creator, and it is created to meet the needs of somebody who wants to get money out of it, its funder or owner. It's born in a specific era, in a specific political environment, which is also one of AI vulnerabilities. It develops and takes in impressions from that basis. So that's kind of its roots. Some AI applications may become very independent. It can go bad, but it is our creation. So all of this is AI. That's why I think AI is a he. Also, let's remember AI is currently not a multitasker. So I think he is quite good. No offense. And other thing, just to point out that AI is, of course, already around us. It is not the time to discuss whether we want to have AI in the world or not. It is there. We use navigation, facial detection, autocorrect, recommender algorithms. We use all of this basically all the time in our modern lives. But was that AI created ethical? So it was, like I said, it was created to kind of replace humans for an issue where it's more efficient to have the tasks, even though it requires intelligence to be automated. It's created to solve a problem where human work is too lengthy or laborious, takes too much time, or it uses a lot of data, or the calculus is very complicated, so computing power is good. And sometimes AI is able to give more instant answers and guidance than humans, where humans would take more time. So this is basically all good. But we have to remember that AI is also basically created to make profits to its owner. And it's a thing to buy. It uses our data, not all AI, but many of them use data, masses of data from people who are not aware that their data is actually being used. It's used to micro-target online citizens for good and bad purposes. And basically what AI does these days, if we think about us as citizens, it finds out, identifies, selects, classifies, rejects, it makes personalized decisions, but we don't really have a handle onto why and how it does this. What data does it use? Why am I getting this? And I think this is kind of the ethical problem of AI. So AI is not ethical by design. This is just quickly, I'll tell a funny experiment that was done by Nick Boström. And it was just the idea that there would be a machine that makes paper clips. So don't mind that the text is not so readable, because basically machines should do paper clips. But if that's all the instruction this poor AI is given, he will keep doing paper clips. He's doing his task. All the humans, the earth, all living creatures, they can be excellent resources for paper clips. So is this AI unethical? I think from his mind, he's doing great because he's doing what he should be doing and getting even more paper clips done. So it is not ethical unless we instruct to AI what ethical is. So the challenge these days is a bit that we are in this mist, like in this picture, there's AI, but I would like to know how he makes his decisions. And I would like to know why he makes his decisions, what's his real aim. And especially sometimes I would like to know whom he's benefiting with his actions. But most of us especially want to know that he makes fair decisions concerning me. And then we would have a rather clear landscape. So how could we understand AI? The first approach, which was, for example, taken by the European Parliament a few years ago, was that, okay, I want to see the AI, show it to me, show the algorithm. And what that made me kind of relate to is that if I have a conclusion, I think about things, I come to the decision X, and somebody would say to me, okay, show me how your neurons work in your brain. And that's not the way we will understand what I do. And that's often the AI is so complicated that it will not help understand the algorithm logic of the AI. Modern computing is so very complicated that it's not practical. So the next step is then that, okay, explain AI to me. And sometimes this is quite useful. We can explain the logic, but the question remains that can we explain simply AI, which is very complex? An example that reminded me of these books was that some years ago already, 5 years ago, I discussed with Google, and that was a time of the Parliament asking that could we have, could we see the algorithm? And they gave me a book which was as thick as the top book at least. And they said that, well, here's the top layer of our algorithm for the search. Obviously, then there's a lot that they don't give out, but AI is complex. We can explain it a bit, but not really so that it's kind of transparent. But what we can do often is that, please AI, justify my results, why you decided that I cannot get that loan or whatever. That is an easier question. So kind of case by case justification we can do by looking at the inputs and outputs, but that does not give an overall confidence on the AI. So what I have been looking at is audit as a tool to verify whether AI is ethical, whether it's doing what it should be doing. And audit is defined as a standardized process that aims at identifying risks and vulnerabilities and verifying that there are sufficient internal controls to mitigate those risks and that those risks are kept at an acceptable level. Basically, that's the idea of audit. And an audit assesses a target system like artificial intelligence and gives recommendations. In order to do this, auditor aims to understand how the system works and then analyze it. So can this be done for artificial intelligence? The types of audit that are standard already, there's a financial audit looking at the accounting, financial transactions, whether they are legal, etc. Operational audits look at the way a system process works and whether that's efficient, effective, and according to plans. Compliance audit looks at compliance with some legislation. And IT audit looks at various aspects of the IT process, data management, audit, programming, etc. And of course, if we think about artificial intelligence, it's software. So all of these audits may be relevant for that also. But I am now looking at what else AI should be targeted for audit. So the question is that can an audit do this? If we have this black box called AI, Can the audit open it? And it cannot. Like I said, the inside of the black box is too complicated, and auditors are not AI experts. Even if they were, you cannot always explain easily and get what the box does. So instead, the AI can look at everything that goes into that box and what comes out of the box, and it can look at the environment around that black box. So the first aim of the audit is to understand what the AI wants to do, what its target is from its owner, developer, etc. Then it has to sample and test, interview people subjected to the AI, and understand how they perceive it. And the question to answer is that, is the AI doing the right thing, and is it doing it well? So what are the challenges if we want to audit AI, especially from the perspective of whether it's ethical? Some AI uses training data. If it's neural networks, machine learning, we have to see whether the training data has some challenges. I find error rate, which is normally defined for an audit, an extremely interesting question for AI. I will come back to that. Does the AI treat minorities equally? And is it fair? And how about exceptions, which is another point which I think is very interesting. What is quite important to see that from the auditing perspective, is the AI resilient against reputational risk is almost a key question. Can the AI survive little mistakes that become big disasters? So about that training data, it should be representative of the whole population, it should have sufficiently low level of errors, and it should have enough information. When I say enough information, what I mean is that, for example, in my past, when I was an actuary working in an insurance company, at that time, the IT people would ask, so which fields do you want for the data? Which issues are essential for this risk calculation? And I would always say, I want it all, because I cannot beforehand know what are the parameters that are significant. So ideally, the training data has enough content for each individual. But even correct data may produce incorrect answers. And this is one of the key problems, because the data that is used, let's say the population is human population that we are looking at here, it is history, it is full of history. And if we think about the world, it's biased, it's always been biased. So the data will be highly likely to reflect that, because it's the correct data of this world. So it may have insufficient amount of minority data. The time span may be too short to identify any trends. And the world is extremely quick these days. It changes, data changes, recent changes may be missing. And as I said, there's bias, it's likely to have bias in the data. And this also indicates that in addition to looking at the data as such, we may need to have some sensitivities that we may separate. So this is basically repetition. So the general audit checks data and checks and analyzes the data on what the training data is, and does it represent the population? Does it have a good coverage? Is it up to date? Is it being updated? And does the AI learn during its existence? And if so, how is new and old data balanced? Is it sufficiently correct? Or like the AI Act of the European Union, the proposal says, is it free of errors? And there are, of course, elements that need to be looked at, which relate more to the kind of IT audit part, but I'm just looking at those parts which are addition to that. So the audit will recommend improving the training data and retraining if there are uncertainties on these angles. Then we come to the interesting point of an error rate. So the audit will check the AI's error rate through sampling. Of course, there will have been validation tests, so it will be interesting to see the results of those. it will compare the error rate with an acceptable error rate, which I come back to. And error rates can also reveal whether the AI has bias. Now, the error rate can be, this is a very simplistic sample. If we think that the output is a number, and we have information from, let's say, our sample or people we've interviewed, what is the AI result or what is the correct result? It's very simple to make an kind of error rate from that, an average error rate. And also, if it's not a number, we can have kind of human interaction of how close or whether at all the answer is correct or not. So that's one thing, we'll have an error rate. The second thing, which is quite important, is that let's take, instead of that sufficient random sample, let's take a sample of a minority. If we think that maybe, I'm not sure how this data, how this AI treats African and American or women or older people or other potential minorities, let's take another error rate. And does the AI have a minority problem? Yes, probably, if the error rate for the minorities is higher than the error rate for the whole population. So this is kind of one solution which is not too difficult to identify, but we do need to know what minorities we want to test: racial, gender, age. So I like the idea of being able to look at the minorities, and these are at least in some industries already in use. Now, so what about the acceptable error rate? In financial audit, 5% can be acceptable and 1% can be even good. But the acceptable error rate for AI tends to be very low when humans are concerned, and lower than what is accepted for humans. Let's say that there would be an AI which would be looking at the whole population of California, 40 million people. 1% would be 400,000 wrong answers, and 1 per mil would be 40,000. So there, and if there's a bias causing the wrong answers, the tolerance is very, very low. So I'll just skip this one. It was another example. So I like the definition of acceptable error rate, which I've heard from Risto Miikkulainen, who was in the Texas University working on neural networks for medicine especially. And he says that AI, the acceptable error rate could be set to be at most as high as the error rate for best alternative and accessible human intervention, so that the AI can be useful, even if not perfect, if it's the best solution. And the next description is saying, should be at the level where using the AI is better than not using it. And the auditor, of course, should then look at the observed and acceptable error rate and potentially propose improvements. Now I'm being a bit too slow, so I'll try to speed up. On fairness, I have an example. Fairness is difficult. So the European Commission aims to be very fair, 40% of each gender, fair distribution of member states. Younger people should have more management possibilities, and the general age pattern of the EC, they aim at rejuvenating it. This is very good and ethical, and this will create a more fair Europe. But it's fair for all, but not for everyone. Let's talk about Koen. He's a great guy. But how is his career going to go? There are too many Belgians, he cannot help being Belgian. 40% women, and it's not reached yet. He cannot help being a man, and he cannot help being over 55. So the aims are not fair for the individual Koen, a Belgian middle-aged guy, and he suffers from a history of mistakes. It's not his mistakes, but still this is the right thing to do. However, we become fair, but we are not fair for everybody. So nobody can be really fair and equal for all. Also, AI cannot be fair and equal for all. Is it enough to be fair in average or for most cases? Sometimes it is, but there's this little issue, which is the residual reputational risk. And that means that the unfair case is something that catches the public, catches an issue of racial unfairness or gender unfairness. And then it's very tricky. So human oversight, running through quickly. So human oversight means that in case the AI needs to be taken over by humans, when would that be? If we come to the exceptional individual that can be harmful for the reputation of the whole AI, the AI would be ideally able somehow to signal that individual. So can the audit verify how the AI treats anomalies and exceptions? And then if it can recommend human oversight. So some AI, like the neural networks, have a kind of confidence level also, which could be used so that if the confidence level of the outcome is low, then that AI could trigger that, well, this is my result, it's a bit low, maybe humans look at it. These are classified, for example, as here, misclassification, out of distribution, or adverse error sample detection. In those cases, the result can look odd, and then we can suggest humans. And in that sense, also the exceptions would be triggered to human oversight, and that would also reduce the residual risk. So the conclusions about auditing ethics of AI is that sometimes we can verify whether AI are rather ethical. Fairness is not unambiguous. Correct data may not be enough to ensure ethical responses, and poor training data for sure brings problems. We may not be able to identify minorities which are not well treated by AI, but we should try. Sometimes human oversight is needed, and exceptions may cause reputational risk for AI. So I think we need an ethical by design approach to AI development. I know that is something that is also being discussed already quite a lot. So then quickly looking at the AI Act proposal of the European Commission. The need for this proposal was risen, as we all know, about the trustworthiness of AI. And the aim of this regulation is to make sure that the Europeans can trust the AI that is used in Europe. It defines AI systems at different risk levels. There are ones that are unacceptable risks. Those are, for example, manipulative government manipulation or stuff like that. High risk AI are subject to strict obligations before they can be put into market, and the proposal basically focuses on that. Then there's a limited risk, which means that the users should be aware that they're interacting with AI. And then there are minimal risk AI, which has no restrictions, as is considered some games to be. So what is the high risk AI that the proposal looks at? They are in these areas: biometric identification, anything on critical infrastructures, education, employment, essential private services, law enforcement, migration, and justice. So where AI that is not trustworthy could cause big damage, basically. So these are concerned by the regulations. And this is, I'm not going to look at that. Those are kind of more precise descriptions of that. And the obligations for this high-risk artificial intelligence are before the launch. There has to be an adequate risk assessment and mitigation systems in place or suggested. If the AI uses training data, the high quality of the training data seems to be needs to be verified to minimize the risk of, for example, discriminatory outcomes. There are requirements for logging and documentations, slightly more encompassing than any IT systems have. A clear and adequate information to the user about the AI. There need to be appropriate human oversight measures in place to minimize the risks so humans can take over in risky situations. And there should be a high level of robustness, security, and accuracy. For example, just a few, some excerpts about transparency. the regulation said that AI systems shall be designed and developed in a way to ensure that their operation is sufficiently transparent to enable users to interpret the system's output and use it appropriately. An appropriate type and degree of transparency shall be then ensured. So it means that we should somehow understand what's happening. About the training data, the requirements are that it should be training, validation, testing data should be relevant, representative, free of errors and complete, which of course it should be. The question, of course, is that sometimes the AI system is in a way ready without the training data, but how that will then be dealt with will be seen at the implementation of the legislation. So some conclusions in this super quick oversight. So Europe wants assurance in areas which are critical and sensitive. The process for launch of an AI application in Europe in high-risk areas is quite demanding, but it's seen essential because of the vulnerability of those areas. We need to know that what AI is used is appropriate. Currently, both Council and Parliament are commenting on the proposal, so it is still only a proposal. They are both coming to some new versions, and the discussion in trilogues with the three different institutions of the European Union will start. It's a good process, the work is ongoing. And to be considered from the angle of what we have discussed, there will be some kind of need for third-party ex-ante audits for those applicants who want to launch AI in Europe in these high-risk areas. Somebody has to kind of go through them and verify whether they are appropriate considering the legislation. That means also that we need to have competent AI auditors. So there need to be a set of qualifications. And there needs to be, and I understand will be, an authority or authorities who will then approve the AI launches in Europe. And just to mention that what I was talking about before was auditing something that already exists. That's called ex post audit. And this is auditing something that is to come, and that's called ex ante audit. So basically, that's it. Apologies for running through a few things and being a bit slow in the beginning, but I'm happy to discuss and answer questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Anni. You can go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and we will get into some good questions that have emerged in the Q&A. And you're able to look along there if that's helpful to you. I'm going to start with a question here from Jessica, which says, from your research, do you think there are important differences between internal auditing efforts and external audits? Is external auditing needed for validity? Do they both play an important role?
Yes, I would say that both are needed. I have been ahead of both internal and external audit units, so I know both worlds. Internal audit is very important for an organization to set into place because they have their own values and standards. And the internal audit will audit kind of against those benchmarks and standards. And there needs to be kind of assurance for the management of the organization. External audit means that there's a third party, some kind of an objective institute or an objective person assigned a third-party auditor who looks from the outside against what the mission from the external auditors is, or the external side is, and then it will answer to those questions. So the roles are both needed. For the AI Act, what I see especially important is the external audit, but obviously the organizations creating the AI will have to have their ethics in place also.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'd also encourage folks in the room to feel free to ask questions if you want to raise a hand. Next question comes from Genevieve, talking about the level of acceptable error rates and bias getting sort of frozen into AI. So some of the error is attributed to bias and it gets built into AI over time, almost freezing it in place, then can't be dissected with AI systems as black boxes. How do we grapple with this AI, bias frozen in AI?
Yeah, well, the bias, there should, let's say there should, of course, not be bias. That's a starting point. If there's bias, there are tools, which I didn't take up here, but there are tools. For example, if we see that there are too few women in the database, in the data, sampling data, training data, which looks at if this would be like acceptance to or a job, something, if there are too many women, too few women, what can be done is that you increase the amount of women, or you duplicate or triplicate those instances. What doesn't work is leaving, for example, gender out, because when you leave the gender out, what happens is that there's the ambient data. Women have not been well treated. It doesn't mean that if you leave the woman out, that will improve the situation of that specific item. So that's one thing. There are ways to kind of get rid of the bias, try to get rid of it. And of course, that should be considered when the training data is done. When I'm saying that the level of AI should be better than not using it, what I mean is, I refer to the example that I got from Professor Mikulainen, who's using AI for medicine, that if there's a village which doesn't have good access to specialists, then if they have an access to an AI tool that will be helpful and will be better than not having anybody there, it will better be to use it than not use it. So when it's genuinely more useful to have somebody there, to have some expertise through that AI system, in case somebody would be risking dying without it, it for sure is better to have it. Of course, AI is proving all the time. I don't say that we have to prove bias or unfairness. I'm saying that those are the issues that the future will really need to look at if we want to make sure that the future AI is ethical.
Thank you.
Anni, I have a question. So your research project, right? It's about trustworthiness and fairness in AI. You've been studying that in European context, right? And then you came to America. You've been now with us for about 8 months, I think, more or less. Can you share with us some thoughts on what surprised you about the American approach to these questions? What differences do you see between the European focus and the American focus?
Well, the ethical side of AI, that discussion is not old. It's started rather recently, and I do think, but it can be also time issue, because I know it's growing everywhere. Everybody's realizing that, okay, now AI is all around us, but we don't really know what it's doing to us. When I've come here, it is in the forefront of discussion. The ethics, the gender fairness, the racial fairness, all of that is very well recognized here. It's likely that it's going on in Europe also, you know, at the same time. But I really appreciate the focus on this side, the trustworthiness and the fairness here. And I think that is really valuable.
I have a question on the background of to make a competent auditor. Do they need a computer science background, or what do you foresee a career trajectory for that type of career?
Yeah, that's a good question indeed. Because that's why I think it's important to see that this is the issue of the black box. The auditor has to know how to do audit. And it has to have some understanding of the field it's auditing. But the desk work part, the first part of an audit is that the auditor will want to have a kind of objective external view of whatever he or she is auditing. And that is what he has, and that's what he works with. And the collaboration with the people who know the area well is of course important. IT audit, for example, is a specialization. I do think that for an AI auditor, he will need to have the IT audit specialization and compliance audit, because the benchmark will be legislation at some stage. So the compliance audit, and then the additional item to the curriculum is that they need to understand what AI means, what kind of different AI there are, the ones that have used training data, the ones that are just complex software programming, etc. And I do think that such a curriculum should be defined, because Europe already needs it with this legislation, and we should all be able to do it. But somehow, I would like to see that curriculum to be created so that the ethical part would be emphasized, and this fairness, ethics, bias, all of that, which is part of our lives, and that needs to be woven into that definition. So there's work to do.
Thank you, great question. I'm going to kind of combine a couple here that I see in the Q&A from David. Does the EU's AI Act apply to military applications? And Chris's question here, you've given some examples of the high-risk areas and what criteria defines how those high-risk areas are determined.
The military applications normally have separate legislations, but the AI refers to them, right? Yes, I have an expert here in the room. So they are separate, yeah. And I'll show you, if I may just share the screen for
Please.
A moment. I'll just show the one screen that I hopped over because it's rather impossible to, there it was. So it is very well described what are the high-risk areas. As you see, I just took the main titles. The idea here is, what I should have said is that the definitions of which are high-risk areas, which are high-risk AI systems, are listed in an annex, because the world is changing and hopefully the legislation will be more stable. So this annex can and will be then updated when it's needed. So here you see many of the areas that within those titles will be considered high risk. But yeah, I think even before the legislative process is over, this might be complemented or changed in some way. But you can see the main points here is somebody applying for work, somebody applying for a loan, or becoming a student, or law enforcement, individual risk assessments. It's all there, and the legislation is also, the proposal is publicly available, but yeah, there's a precise list currently. There's been some discussion and some comments that instead of a list, it should be left vague, but this is the current approach.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annie, for the great presentation. You touched on it at the end about the independent AI auditor. Who should it be? Should it be a private entity, or should it be a public authority? So who should be the independent AI auditor?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's some thinking on these issues going on in the Commission already. I think what will happen is that this institute, or this body that will be the supervisory body that approves the AI, will give assignments to specialized private audit companies, those that are kind of accredited auditors. And many of the big companies are considering AI audit. I just haven't had good examples of how they're doing it. But I think there needs to be this objective body, and then there needs to be the objectiveness of the third party. They could also consider having auditors internally in that body, like the European Commission, for example, has. But I think at the beginning, at least, that is how it's going to be. It could be either.
Thank you. Okay. We have time for just a couple more. I see a question here, again, referring to bias. How do you handle for bias with regard to the people who are developing these algorithms? For example, if you have an insular or a non-diverse team creating or managing these programs, should this be a part of the auditing process?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And that's why I said in the beginning that the AI is not just the code, it's the whole thing. Who's created it? It's that team. And to understand what the AI is, you have to understand what the team is. And very often we create, instead of thinking, well, that's a problem that needs a solution. We need to find, the AI should do a solution for this problem. We think, well, this is my solution to the problem, I'll program it, and that's it. And there's always the risk of bias. And I've even seen that there are some developments from the Stanford AI Index, for example, that the bias is even increasing, but that has not intentional factors, but the factor of in a way, better data. But the bias is and will remain an issue that we need to be very careful about. That's why I said in the last point in the training data is that we have to take into account the political sensitivities. Like currently, we want there to be more women, but then at some stage, maybe there is enough and we can kind of not look at that potential bias so much. But yeah, bias is a challenge, and my data science colleagues know probably much more about that than I do.
Okay. And then final question, CLTC, we like to be kind of a translation belt. How do we make these abstract kind of technical concepts understandable to all different types of stakeholders and audiences? So there's a question here, which I admire from Michael, who is interested in understanding, more of these issues, wants to be more involved in these issues, but only quote unquote sort of understands the potential implications of AI. So what would you recommend for someone who doesn't have the technical background, but wants to be more involved? What are some ways to get more involved? And then the second part to that question, at CLTC, we just launched the AI Policy Hub and are now accepting applications for graduate students at UC Berkeley to be a part of this program and help make meaningful contributions to the AI policy landscape. So for the kind of general stakeholder, how can they get involved? And for graduate students at UC Berkeley, what sort of research questions would be most helpful to answering some of these AI policy questions?
Well, that's another very good question. So the first answer is that they should apply to your future policy hub.
Easy club.
What I have seen at least in Berkeley is that it's very horizontal. So in whichever part of Berkeley, California University you are, these questions are discussed. So I think it's very easy within the university to kind of initiate that kind of discussion. Otherwise, I come from the European Union, so I'm not able to so much say what would be the best way here. But I do think that with all this discussion and concern about different kinds of ethical issues like the bias, you will find a forum, you will find in your specific field that discussion is being held or will be held somewhere. So unfortunately, more than that, I'm not able to say concretely.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Anni. That is all the time we have. Let's give another round of applause. For that fascinating discussion, and thank you to our audience, both in person and virtually, for such an engaging Q&A. I am going to quickly share my screen just to share a couple of ways that you can keep in touch with Anni. She has graciously shared her email and her Twitter handle if you would like to continue the discussion or ask a question that didn't get discussed today. And I will leave this slide up for a minute or two in case folks want to jot down some information. And that's it. Thank you once again to everyone in the audience for joining us today. And we hope you'll join us at the next virtual or hybrid event. Until then, take care.
And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
It was great.